Where am I? There I am. Hi, friends. Hello. Welcome. I know, listen, it's 10 a.m. Eastern on a Friday. I know. The timing, it's not like the most prime time for live, but I don't care, okay? When you do this full time, you don't think about it like that. But I'm happy to have you here for the live stream. If you're listening on the podcast whenever we post this, welcome in. Thank you for being here. This will be a great response video. We're going to move pretty quickly here. Our time is limited this morning. I'm bringing on a friend, someone that I've had on the podcast several times, and an amazing scholar, really, of Christian nationalism. He wrote the book most recently, American Idolatry, how Christian nationalism betrays the gospel and threatens the church. Please, friends, help me welcome Dr. Andrew Whitehead. It's good to have you, Andrew. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to talking more about all this and seeing where we go.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have you on. We're going to go through just a few clips of an interview that was done by William Wolfe, and I believe his name is James Hames, about Christian nationalism. Now, friends, if you follow me on Twitter, you know me and William Wolfe go back and forth. Maybe too much. I'm kind of backing away from Twitter. I'm just kind of like, leave it to them to, be in their echo chamber, because I don't know, it's becoming more and more a waste of my time. But me and William have talked privately. We've talked publicly. We were on an interview together with the Honest Youth Pastor. I want to say that two caveats to our conversation. First off, I think what William is advocating for is incredibly problematic. I think it's built on anti-intellectualism, and I think that, honestly, it's very detrimental to most of our neighbors. However, we also at TNE have a very strong ethic of non-dehumanization, because my position would be that the Christian nationalism that people like William are advocating for is inherently dehumanizing, and we don't want to repeat that cycle of chaos. So the goal here is not to dehumanize William or to make fun or to belittle who he is as a human. He's made in the Imago Dei. However, we do want to respond to a few of his assertions about what he thinks Christian nationalism is. And I'm not the academic here. I'm not the scholar. I have not written the book on Christian nationalism. But Andrew has written really two books, right? You wrote Taking America Back for God. You co-wrote it with Perry, Dr. Perry. What's his first name?
Sam.
There it is. Oh, yeah, there it is. Thank you. With Samuel Perry, and now you have this other book out. So it's good to have you. You want to give a quick intro to anyone and kind of give, just a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm a sociologist, social scientist, and been doing that for, I guess, since 2012 is when I graduated, but 2007 is when I started. So it's been, 15 so years, and studying Christian nationalism for a little over 10. And so these two books are the culmination of a lot of that work. But then it's also based on maybe around 20 peer-reviewed articles as well, written with a number of co-authors, and Sam's with that as well. So, and then I'm also a person of faith, identify as a Christian, grew up in a conservative Christian area. And so a lot of the taken for grantedness of this idea of a Christian nation was what I grew up in, I was handed. But then, on my journey, maybe the same, for you, Tim, or for others, we just start to think through what we were taught the Christian faith was all about, and then looking at the way that this was being lived out and thinking, well, that doesn't quite make sense. So that kind of is what started me, to apply, the tools of social science to try and understand too more of this taken for granted cultural framework that we'll talk about more, but what Christian nationalism is and what it's associated with. And I think that's where social science is really useful, because it kind of pops open the hood and shows, we're not just talking about like, hey, Christianity and kind of put it in the public sphere and nothing to worry about. Right. But when people think of privileging Christianity, we find over and over it's associated with a lot of different stuff. And that's what I think we need to, as Christians or Americans, people interested in democracy, that's what we need to be wrestling with. That's kind of been my journey.
Great. Well, we're going to hop into it. First, I want to applaud Christian. It's 7 a.m. here, and I need a prize for getting up this early. Christian, your reward is in heaven, my friend, okay? You're just stacking up those jewels. So, maybe man doesn't see it now, but God sees the heart. So thank you. And Kim brought up a great point, and don't worry, Kim, I thought about this. I don't know who William Wolfe is. Don't
Yeah.
worry. I got you covered. I know. I know that when you're in this world all the time, you just assume that everyone knows these names. I got you covered. So let's just start here. Here's just kind of the intro that James gave to the podcast. He introduces some names. I'm going to break down a few of who those people are, give you some clips of them, and then we're going to start responding to the actual interview with William Wolfe. So here's the first part of it. Here we go.
A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to attend the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference, where I had the pleasure of interviewing many of the leading voices who are currently advocating for Christian nationalism. These voices include Doug Wilson, Toby Sumpter, Chocolate Knox, Joel Webbon, Stephen Wolfe, and William Wolfe.
Okay, so really quick, these are a lot of names that you might not know. So I pulled a few excerpts from some of these men, okay? So you can see who we're talking about. Now, the first one I'm going to show you is Stephen Wolfe. He wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. I'll just say that even a lot of conservative folks found the book very problematic, okay? So this is not a conservative-liberal dichotomy. Christian nationalism, I'm more convinced, Andrew, that it's kind of its own thing entirely, maybe for a different discussion. But here's a clip. This is Stephen Wolfe talking on a podcast. Here's what he advocates for as far as what he calls Christian nationalism. Take a listen right here.
And it's saying like what's gonna prevent us from being Christian nationalists? Well, what's to bring it in a Christian nation that follows kind of principles of Christian nationalism. And I think one of it is going to be I don't think it could happen when women are generally kind of in charge and rule things. And that's because women tend they're very empathetic. Mm-hmm. They tend to be more inclusive, and men tend to be more exclusive, and they tend to So there's these different traits that you see between the sexes, and in order to have a Christian nation where where blasphemy is punished by someone who seems well-meaning and nice and smiles big, you're going to have a guy who says, no, you're going to jail. Right. I mean, or whatever it is that you're fined them. I mean, because I'm all for blasphemy laws, by the way. If you're going to suppress atheism, I mean, there might be some very nice guy who has a big smile, loves atheism. Like, no, atheism is crushed. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be tolerated.
There you go. There you go. I mean, friends, this is not out of context. We're not picking, I'm not using AI to stitch things and make people say things that they're not saying. That's a real segment from a real podcast by an author whose book is called A Case for Christian Nationalism. You can hear already how it does not care about free speech. It does not care about the humanity of women and their ability to lead, and that atheism is crushed. So that's the first person on that board that was at this conference. Here's the other one. Now, this is an excerpt from Doug Wilson. I'm actually going to read you a quote. Doug Wilson is probably the most well-known out of this group. He's kind of the one who really oversees a lot of this stuff, and he let's just say there's a lot of things that are problematic. In fact, on the podcast, we actually interviewed Doug Wilson for a segment and pulled some of the clips.
Oh, wow.
So he talked to us. He talked to Dan Ketchpole, one of our journalists, and it was something. So here's just an excerpt from a book that Doug had. Can you hear me now? My bad, friends. Sorry. Are you reading this? All right. I'm going to say this one more time from the top. I'm so sorry. I was muted. Here's what this quote says, friends. I have to read it for the podcast audience. Slavery as it existed in the South was not an adversarial relationship with pervasive racial animosity. Because of its predominantly patriarchal character, it was a relationship based upon mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. The credit for this must go to the predominance of Christianity. The gospel enabled men who were distinct in nearly every way to live and work together, to be friends and often intimates. This happened to such an extent that moderns indoctrinated on civil rights propaganda would be thunderstruck to know the half of it. Slave life was to the slave a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food, clothes, and good medical care. In spite of the evils contained in the system, we cannot overlook the benefits of slavery for both blacks and whites. Slavery produced in the South a genuine affection between the races that we believe we can say has never existed in any nation before the war or since. Now, this gets worse, friends, because when Doug came under fire for this years later, he wrote a blog post, okay? And he said in part, if I were to tackle this topic today, which I guess I'm doing right now, I would not want to use any of the words that implied that I knew how to quantify the two kinds of experiences, meaning if it was good or bad precisely. I would not want to say anything like most or almost all or anything like that. I would content myself with saying that there were many horrific abuses and that there were many situations that were characterized by benevolent masters, and leave it at that. Okay, guys, I'm just trying to demonstrate to you. This is what folks like Doug Wilson and this whole world, this is what they're talking about. And if you don't believe me, I have one more clip, and then we're going to hop into it. This is Joel Webbon. He's another person listed on that little segment there. Here's his clip talking also about slavery. And this is I think he said this in 2022, 2021. This is a recent thing. Here's what he said.
Last bastion, like a final resistance in this little town, Moscow, Idaho. And they talk about
that's
how
Doug Wilson's
simultaneously
church,
this
friends.
is going
Doug
on,
Wilson's
with
church.
like Russell Moore, and then over here, in Nashville, there's a Fight Laugh Feast conference, and this is going down, and Doug Wilson's there, and these guys, and they just say what the Bible says, and they don't apologize, and they're not embarrassed. They're not. I have spent, to my shame, I thought I was cool. I was not cool. It's embarrassing. It is embarrassing that I, for years, was embarrassed by the Bible. Not all of it, but there were certain parts that, I'd be embarrassed about, like slavery or something like that, And whereas now, I had somebody recently on my show, and they brought up slavery, and they're a Christian, but you could tell it was a little bit like kind of embarrassed, and they were saying, kidnapping. And so the African slave trade, America, man stealers, that was a crime, biblically and punishable and atrocious in the sight of God. And so America has bad roots. And I paused him for a second. Well, just for the record, real quick, the founders weren't going to Africa and stealing people. They were buying them. So who stole them? And then there's,
so there you go, friends. Okay, there's Joel. It's like, wait, is that the slam dunk you really think it is? Oh, they were only buying people. They were only buying them. I mean, again, friends, I try and always give my audience sources so they know when I tell people what Christian nationalism can advocate for. I'm not lying. And lastly, friends, here's William Wolfe's tweets. This is who we're talking about today. Here's just a few of his tweets. This is the interview that we're going to watch clips of and kind of respond to. Take a good look. I'm not going to read through all of them, but one of them, for example, is want to restore the American family, end no-fault divorce, end abortion, reduce access to contraceptives, require men to provide for their children as soon as it's determined the child is theirs, end sex education in public school, end surrogacy, overturn Obergefell. That's gay rights. Another quote, just for the podcast audience. My first Christian nationalist proposal is to close the border. Second is outlaw gay pride parades and drag queen story hour. Okay, so, all right. Now, we're all settled in, right? We're all here. The last thing I'm going to say, that I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, who'll start responding to this, is Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this. So just say, Tim, you're missing it. But my impression from reading what I've read is that there's kind of two different flavors, broadly speaking, of Christian nationalism. You have the more New Apostolic Reformation type, the Sean Foyt type. It's usually more embodied in like a charismatic sense of Christianity. This flavor with the Doug Wilsons and Stephen Wolfes and William Wolfes comes more from, I would say, the more reformed, like R.J. Rushdoony, dominionism perspective. I think, honestly, they both come out of that spring bring, but they kind of manifest very differently. So I have noticed that there are some different focuses. In this case, we're going to hear a lot about biblical law and what it means to institute biblical law. I don't know if Sean Feucht would use that language, even if it produces the same result, but there is some separation here with Christian nationalism. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, no, I think that there is, some various strands within this broader kind of understanding of what Christian nationalism is. So this cultural framework that we can talk about is really flexible, and it is used by groups differently the way they understand it. But there's a really great clip of Sean Feucht, and I think we used it in the podcast I created, that 4-part podcast with Brad Onishi from Straight White American Jesus, where Sean Feucht is saying, like, do we want laws based on the Bible? Yes. And he's like naming these different things.
I know that clip very well.
right. And so in that sense too, like he's really kind of responding in a similar way. But there's kind of this reformed stream, more like you said, Pentecostal Paula White type of feeling too. Like there are a number of different ones. And I think what's interesting about that as well is that those different strands of Christianity have deep differences theologically, but what unites them is this idea of privileging a conservative, understanding expression of Christianity in the public sphere. So, I mean, that's a deep underlying question too, Tim, right? Like when they're like, Christianity needs to be privileged, well, which Christianity, right? Is it the one where we sprinkle water or we baptize fully? Are all the gifts of the Spirit still with us or not? Like these are big things that, Christians divide over. But if we're talking about a Christian nation, they have very distinct understanding of what comes with that, and we can kind of pop the hood on that and think through what are those other cultural beliefs and values that they're really talking about when they say Christian. It's a lot more than just these orthodox theological beliefs.
Well, so this is a good example. So here's the first opening statement by James introing the actual podcast about what something must be for it to be Christian.
For a thing to be Christian, it must be rooted and grounded in the Word of God. So if that is...
So that's the first clip I want to pull up, is that, and you mentioned this in our recording, or in our prep, that, go ahead and just opine on that thing. So I'm curious why you wanted to highlight that part.
Well, I think right off the bat, that's really important, right? Where they're talking about, these things must be biblical. Or if you go watch the whole video, you're going to talk about biblicism and rooted in the Bible. And again, that brings with it a lot that is unsaid, right? It's carrying a lot of weight when we say, it should just be biblical, because there are different parts, and they're going to talk about different parts. And there are folks that take the Bible very seriously that come to very different conclusions about what Christians should be doing and how they should be operating out in the world, right? So just take new evangelicals, for example, right? Do you take the Bible seriously? Yes. But there are aspects of it, maybe a justice orientation, right, that really motivates this group or, this world that you're a part of, and that I might be a part of too, where for them, it's something very different. But when they say biblical, again, they're thinking in a very particular way about very particular parts, and then that is it. And so that again is unsaid. And so just keeping that in mind of, well, which Bible, what parts, I think that's part of the discussion, but in this sense, it's all taken for granted.
I mean, think about what we just shared with Doug Wilson and Joel Webbon, who are like, hey, slavery, maybe not that bad. And Doug Wilson would argue that slavery is a very biblical idea. And he's not wrong, by the way. It's in the Bible. Right. Like, that's one of the major problems with it, right? So to your point, that's exactly right. The term biblical is carrying the weight of the world as defined by these folks. And anyone who would see the Bible differently is no longer, in their mind, biblical. So this brings us to kind of the definition. Like, what is Christian nationalism, right? So William Wolfe, here's what he said, and then we can respond.
Christian nationalism is nothing more than an effort to recover historic Protestant, Reformed, Orthodox political theology and then apply it faithfully to our lives today in what could be called, as Aaron Wrenn has, a negative world. A world in which Christianity is certainly no longer sort of the socially favored religious class in America. We live in an age post-Obergefell. We live in an age, of transnation, and we have seen the myth of the secular neutrality shatter, I think, in the eyes of many Christians who had bought into that myth in previous decades. And now many people are trying to figure out a path forward. And so Christian nationalism is really nothing more than trying to work out the implications of the fact that...
Do you want me to go to the next part of that too? Because he kind of goes on a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Let's hear it, because I think it goes with...
Yeah.
word. And so Christian nationalism is really nothing more than trying to work out the implications of the fact that Christ is king. Right. And he's not just king of your heart, he's king of the public square as well. It's an effort to interpret and explain Romans 13, that all authority in heaven and earth has been instituted by God, and there's no authority that exists that hasn't been instituted by him, and they're therefore responsible to bear the sword and act justice.
I try to stop right here really quick. He doesn't actually mean this, because right now Joe Biden is in authority in America, but that doesn't count for him. So what has to happen is that the new logic is, oh, well, that election was stolen, right? So like this all kind of plays off of each other, friends. When they say that like that God has given power to those in authority, he doesn't mean every person in authority. He means the ones that he believes God has ordained, and the ones that God has not ordained need to be taken down and destroyed, because that's what maybe he would call is secularism or liberalism or whatever it might be. So just a very important point there. All right, we're almost done with the clip.
According to his good standards of good and evil. And that to me is Christian nationalism in a nutshell.
There you go.
All right. Lots to unpack here.
What are your thoughts?
Here we go. Yeah, so one thing to notice, right, in both these clips, and it happens a number of times throughout, is kind of a rhetorical move of, Christian nationalism is nothing more, or it really isn't anything more than, X, Y, and Z. And so I think that in some ways is a rhetorical move, right, to just kind of be like, this isn't that big of a deal. And one thing, too, I appreciate what you said at the beginning about, William or others who are thinking about their faith and how it interacts in the public square. Like, we're all doing that, right? And so that in and of itself is not a bad thing. Right. But like you, I've been convinced by the empirical data that believing that the U.S. should be a distinctively Christian nation, or in serving the American public, when folks think through that and they hear those words, when I see what that's associated with as a Christian, that's when I'm like, okay, so that isn't what I think Christianity should be moving towards. And we can kind of talk about that too. So yeah, when folks are hearing those words, I think we have to be careful too. It isn't just this little like, oh, we just want to kind of work out how to, the Bible tells me so, and Jesus loves me and you, and that's it. No, there are very real implications when they're imagining a Christian nation, and being real about what those are. And so again, we can walk through those. And so, yeah, there are other parts to this where, Romans 13, and we can kind of come back to that. But I think what I want to do is just highlight really quickly, well, what is a definition of Christian nationalism from the scholarly research, right? And so this is built off empirical research of the American public as we survey Americans. And what we have come to find in the way that I define Christian nationalism, and again, it isn't just kind of made out of thin air, but what we see it's associated with over and over. So Christian nationalism is a cultural framework. And when we talk about cultural frameworks, what we mean by that is a collection of myths and narratives, symbols, value systems. All of those things make up cultural frameworks. And so Christian nationalism is one of those. Yeah. And it idealizes and advocates for the fusion of a very particular expression of Christianity with American civic life. And so the key part of that is it's a particular expression of Christianity, right? And so we have to recognize and realize, obviously, there are many different expressions of Christianity, but this is looking at a very particular one that should be elevated and should be the principal and undisputed cultural framework of the United States. And that the government should vigorously preserve and perpetuate this cultural framework. So again, it's not referring just to orthodox theological beliefs that, we would hold similarly as Christians with William Wolfe, right? Divinity of Jesus or different things like that.
Right. Physical resurrection, virgin birth, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. But it brings with it all this extra cultural baggage, right? And so when folks are talking about making this a Christian nation or making America more godly, or that the U.S. should follow biblical principles, or the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, is like, hey, just go read the Bible. That's my worldview. Okay, That's carrying a lot of weight. There's a lot coming with that. There are a lot of unspoken assumptions to that. And that's where we have to really dive in and look at, okay, well, what do they actually mean by biblical? And what we find over and over is that they have a very particular understanding of what that means. And so I'm just going to list the elements of Christian nationalism, this extra cultural baggage, and then we can kind of unravel these as we go. So
Great.
the first thing that will come out that we find is associated with Christian nationalism, this extra cultural baggage, is a desire for traditionalist social arrangements. And just what we've already talked about with Stephen Wolfe, William Wolfe, with Doug Wilson, we can unpack what traditionalist social arrangements mean, and that revolves around gender and sexuality. The second is the comfort with authoritarian social control. And so this is where we see the threat to democracy and a pluralistic democratic society really start to play out. And again, you can hear that just in that definition of Christian nationalism. The other element that we find over and over is this strong association with the desire for strict ethno-racial boundaries. Right. And so some of the things you've already quoted, we can unpack that. And then finally, a populism, this idea that like we, quote unquote, are representing the true America and true Americans, and that elites are trying to come in and take that away and chip away at what it really is all about. And again, we already heard that with this idea of the globalist elite, and that type of thing. But that then too, basically makes them more likely to take on this kind of victimhood and persecution, right? That this world is being taken away from us. And so conspiratorial thinking is intimately intertwined with that. So as we think about Christian nationalism, desire to privilege a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life, and that is strongly associated with a desire for traditionalist social arrangements, a comfort with authoritarian social control, strict ethno-racial boundaries, and populism and conspiratorial thinking. That's what we find in this package.
My good friend Neil, I've known him for over a decade, says, is it fair to add white to Christian nationalism? What's your thoughts on that? I hear people go back and forth. I know David Gushee likes the term authoritarian reactionary Christianity. What are your thoughts with adding white to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think Neil is right on. And I think we should, preface it with white. And really one of those elements with strict ethno-racial boundaries is highlighting the fact that Christian nationalism as it operates in the U.S., what we find over and over is that it is strongly associated with whiteness. And so it isn't about the color of a person's skin who is embracing Christian nationalism, but the fact that Christian nationalism and the cultural baggage it brings with it, over and over tends to privilege white Americans as a group. So it doesn't mean that all white Americans do better. That's not what we're saying.
Right.
But the idea that we live in a racialized society where white Americans tend to do better as a group, Christian nationalism undergirds that. And so it really is a white Christian nationalism in undergirding and privileging whiteness. And the empirical data is, there's so much of it, right? Like when we look at maternal death rate, infant death rate, when we look at wealth in families, how COVID affected people, we see over and over that white Americans as a group do better than ethnic and racial minorities.
And this is why I really enjoy having you on, because I really like letting the audience hear from people who actually have done the work. Listen, I'm more of a commentator. I do more content creation than the actual academic work. That's not my world at all. But having people like you is so needed, because you can say, actually, I have the data to back up what I'm saying. I'm not pulling things out of thin air and rage tweeting, right? To your point, one of William's tweets, which I didn't, or whatever post, which I did not share, he highlights that, the real conspiracy, one of the things is systemic racism as opposed to January 6th, right? So you can just see the dichotomy. Let's keep going. I know time is ticking. Let's keep walking through here. Here's another thing, and tell me which one this falls into when we play of those categories that you just mentioned.
We should not, and particularly as men shouldn't be making decisions off of whether something makes them feel scared, right? This is a true point. Women factor the vast majority of their decisions through an emotional framework of security. How does this make me feel? And then effeminate men and female adjacent men do the same thing. And so when that's right. So when we're
so I just have two quick points here. Number one, this is like a conservative evangelical trope I hear all the time. Like, we can't be dictated by feelings. We're humans. Okay, feelings absolutely affect how we act as human beings. Like, I hate to break it to people, but the idea that you could just be this rational robot is not a thing. I don't care if you're me or if you're William or Trump or I don't care. So that's number one. I disregard that entire idea. Number two, and this is a big thing that you hear from William and folks like them. We can't operate in fear. Their whole persona is based on something being taken away from them, right? There's this thing out there that's coming for them. They're losing influence in the public sphere. Christianity is no longer privileged like how it should be. We're under attack. It's a complete fear-based mindset. Now, listen, I frankly, I'm scared of things too. Okay, Christian nationalism scares me. I'm not claiming, right, that like, oh, well, we can't operate out of fear. No, I'm freaked out about Christian nationalism. But I have found people like William try to portray this like, well, as these alpha males who need to work out all the time and eat steak, we can't be governed by our feelings or by fear. But their whole world is governed off of both of those things. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think one of the key idols that I write about in American Idolatry of Christian nationalism is fear, right? And as we look through the decades and back through American history, over and over, as people use fear to draw these tight boundary lines around who we are and who we're not, and who's coming for us, right? And so it really creates these strong in-group boundaries of like, we need to be afraid of them who are coming to steal away our country, or right, when I think you even showed one of the tweets of immigrants, right? They're coming to stab you. Like he literally says they're going to come stab you. Empirically, and this is what I talk about in the book, empirically, when we look at communities with higher levels of immigrants, they have less crime. There's either no association or the association is positive or is strong and less crime. And so again, as Christians, it isn't as though fear isn't something that we're going to experience. It is. I'm with you, Tim. Sure. But we have to think through, okay, so then how as a Christian do I interpret this? One way is to see, well, should I actually be afraid of this? So when we're talking about immigration specifically, the answer is no, you shouldn't, right? There is no fear that is empirically grounded in truth of anything. And so, yeah, I think fear is a key part of it, and it's one of the key idols of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I agree. And just to be clear, obviously people anywhere can do bad things all the time, just like how we cover tons of examples of pastors doing bad things to kids, right? But that doesn't mean that we think every single pastor is a bad person. So what I found in these spaces is that they'll take anecdotal evidence, right, like examples of something, and then they'll apply that to the whole, right? So, oh, look, this person was an immigrant, this person committed a crime, therefore all immigrants are coming to commit crime. Yeah. That's the leap in logic and that's where data helps, right? Because data can help us get out of our own heads from even our own experiences sometimes and say, okay, maybe what I experienced was bad and was, of course, horrible. We should try and make sure that doesn't happen again. But is this happening beyond my own experience, right? That's the difference. And that's why data really helps us. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's great.
Cool. Let's keep going. This is fun.
And so Christian nationalism actually really isn't an effort to make the church be the state or make the state be the church, but really to call on the state to rule rightly and to honor God rightly, and then further to recognize,
Sorry, at whose request? Like this is another complete thing that, again, just unpack it. So the church shouldn't govern. Let me go back so I don't take it out of context here.
Christian nationalism actually really isn't an effort to make the church be the state.
Okay, so it's not an effort to make the church be the state. Okay.
Or make the state be the church,
or make the state be the church. So he's actually advocating for what sounds like a separation of the church and the state, which he thinks is a bad thing.
Really to call on the state to rule rightly and to honor God rightly, and then further to
but it's a call on the state to honor God and to act rightly. Again, who's directing the state then? The church. That's his version of whoever the church is, right? It's definitely not all churches. It's not mainline Protestant churches. It's a very particular flavor of church that's then going to direct how the government should rule. So again, he tries to say in the beginning, it's not about merging the two, but in reality, it's about, maybe he would say, because I don't want to put him in the worst light possible, maybe he would say, no, people as Christians, and we're part of the church, we have an obligation to be part of the civil process and to advocate for laws and rules that would be God honoring. That's a very fancy way of saying the church should be the one directing the government flat out. But let's finish up the quote, and then I'll give it over to you.
Outside of the boundaries of the government itself, we have a society, we have a civic polity, we have a moral character to the people of our nation. So what are the things that we should be encouraging in our civil life? Should we be encouraging, pride parades where we see men in tidy whities twerking in front of kids, right? Or should we be encouraging, truth, goodness, and beauty? And so
All right, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, too, in some of the language there, the idea of, he's speaking in terms of Christians, right? Having the values and beliefs that they hold dear, and wanting to see those represented in the public sphere, right? If we just look at that, it's like, well, Martin Luther King Jr. or other, civil rights leaders, they were working from a place of faith, wanting to see their society change in a direction of justice for all. And that, is an idea that many Americans too would look back and say, yeah, like, let's go, let's do that. And I think that's true, right? It isn't that Americans of any religious belief or no religious belief shouldn't bring their personally held values and beliefs into the public square. That we should do. But it's which ones, and then two, which ones get privileged, and does everybody have that same right? And I think, in this clip or in the whole interview, or if we push a little bit harder, it becomes clear that no, not everyone has that right. Right. So this country was created by and for white Anglo-Protestant men, essentially. And those are the folks that truly represent it. And so when we're looking at access to civil rights, civil benefits, or having a say in what this country is going to look like, those people are at the top of the social order with other people coming behind. And so that's where this element of traditionalist social arrangements comes in, where Americans that are, married in a heterosexual marriage, have children, biological children, you kind of like, lift up pronatalism, like we need to be having families. And those are the folks that truly represent what this country is all about. And they're going to have access to civil rights. But what we find is that Americans that do not represent that, when we survey the American public, folks that embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to say, no, that these other families, these other people should not have the same rights, should not be able to access the same civil benefits as everyone else. And so that, I think, is where it isn't just Christians bringing, some of their beliefs into the public square. It's these are the beliefs that should be elevated, and others shouldn't have that same aspect or possibility. And so I think that's the key kind of point to pull on.
I think that's really important, because I want to be clear on our end. What we're not saying is that people like William Wolfe should not have access to constitutional rights. They should absolutely have the freedom to say what they want. They have a freedom to advocate for whatever they would like. But what they're advocating for is saying, we want to be at the top, and the groups or lifestyles we consider, whatever, that we deem unbiblical will be disadvantaged intentionally by the government or by, maybe the cultural perspective. I mean, to Doug Wilson's point, when we interviewed him, he mentioned, thank God he didn't go as extreme to say that we should stone gay people like R.J. Rushdoony has said in the 60s, but he did say that essentially he would want to make culture very hostile towards queer people. That way they would feel like they couldn't be part of society if, as those people, right? So the idea is creating a society that has these new norms of what's accepted and what's not, as opposed to recognizing that every person in America is entitled to the same civil rights and right to freedom, happiness, etc. under the law. And so I think that is a big distinction here, because we're not trying to say people like William can't have those freedoms. We're just trying to simply say the net is wider than what William is advocating for.
Yeah,
by the way,
sure.
Here I have the clip of the assumed founding if you want me to play it.
Go
ahead. About that. Yeah.
But I've said this before, and it's gotten some good traction. I'll say it again: is that I think that Christian nationalism was the assumed context of the classical liberal founding of the American nation. But now that assumed context is totally evaporated. Yeah. And so as they assumed that the character of the people who were inhabiting the new American nation would be of Christian character, even if they weren't of necessarily Christian confession.
Right.
And you can't assume that anymore. So Christian nationalism in the American context could simply be seen as an effort to enshrine a lot of what was assumed at the founding.
That's really good.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. There's another part of it too, where I think he might even preface that point where he would say he's not an expert of the founding period. And so I just wanted to pull a couple books that have been helpful to me. I cite these. One is, here, let me get it right. The Face of the Founding Fathers by David Holmes. And then Was America Founded as a Christian Nation by John Fea. Those are two helpful books. There's many others that people could check out, but go and read those, because what those do is they show in the historical record, both in the founding documents, as we look at the founding fathers themselves. Some were Christian, many were deists, others were, of no religious faith at all. And so kind of having that understanding is key. But then even as we look back to that time, there's a really great book, The Churching of America by Roger Finke and Rodney Stark. And they look at the colonial period and they're like, it's actually a lot less Christian than people think, right? Like, and they go through a lot of this data of what was happening then, like rates of marriage and all this other stuff. And they were like, it wasn't that Christian as we might understand it, but it became more so. In some ways where that became kind of the assumption. And so I think, obviously Christianity was important in this period. No reputable historian would say otherwise. But to say that it undergirds it all, I think that actually is what any reputable historian would say. No, it was more Enlightenment. And William, to his credit, says that in the interview as well, that Enlightenment thought was, a part of it. But it was actually a very big part. And that's why the founding documents don't explicitly mention Jesus, right? Or even God explicitly.
Or God, right.
Or the Bible, right? It's just the, providence, creator, all of these things. And so I think there are a lot of good resources out there that helps kind of make sense of that. And I think that's a key part of this journey that folks might be on, right? That I've been on, is like, we hear the narrative, we heard the stories, the taken for grantedness that, it was just a Christian nation. They were evangelical like us. That is just not true.
Right.
And so
Thomas Jefferson literally ripped out all the supernatural parts in his Bible.
Right. It's just totally
very different, know?
Yeah. So, Christianity played a role. It was a part of it for sure. But to say that, but even if that was true, we are not in the same country now, right? There is so much more religious and racial diversity. To want to re-enshrine a particular expression of Christianity as the taken for granted kind of cultural assumption that he's talking about, just would never work. Right. And we shouldn't really want that to work if we're going to kind of live in a pluralistic democratic society. So as this country becomes less Christian, if we look at it demographically, how would Christians want to be treated if we're in a, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy? I think then we start to think, well, then how should we be treating others? Right. I think that's where we should be pushing, is like, how can we live as a part of a diverse nation where everyone has the opportunity to flourish? And I think that should be the goal, and how we get there and how we do that. Yeah.
Christian says, more of Dr. Andrew. He's fire. So there you go,
thanks,
friends.
Christian.
You're crushing it. And friends out there, just in case you really need like a real hard piece of evidence about like this point, look, okay. In our own Constitution right now, no religious test shall ever be required as qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This is intentional. All right, the founding fathers, whatever, the authors of the Constitution, they knew the culture and intentionally made it so a religious test or being religious was not required to prove anything in order to serve in office in America. So there's a reason why God's not in the Constitution. There's a reason why things like this are in the Constitution. No matter what people like William will tell you, the reality is the founding document that governs at least the foundation of the country is intentionally secular, meaning it does not mention some kind of divine anything. There's no God of any privilege or of any faith mentioned there. This is actually an important point, though, and we're going to get into this other quote here, because I have found that this kind of Christianity is so bizarre, because William, like, I grew up just hearing all the time, it's we're saved by grace through faith. A real Christian is not work-based. It's not about your moral goodness. It's all about trusting in the work of Christ. But William starts separating things out here, right? Like, well, maybe the founding fathers weren't Christian in belief, but were Christian in, I think, like morality or practice, something like that. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? Because at least from my perspective and from what I was told, those things are they're peanut butter and jelly. They just go together. They are a package deal. And so it's interesting watching people start to separate the two and say, well, our nation can be Christian in the sense of the moral things we're advocating for, but people don't have to be actually like confessional Christians in order to. It's just a very weird thing for me to understand. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point in another way too, is like, as Christians, we think about how to live out some of the beliefs that we have and how to live morally and to love our neighbor, right, as ourselves. All of these things that we see as a part of the Christian story, recognizing that other religious faiths also hold these same, values in a similar way. And folks that are secular too, right, will hold these same values of the humanity of others, or trying to solve, inequality in some way, if taking care of the poor, those that are downtrodden, or those that are marginalized. Like, how can we live and work and create a society where everybody has equal opportunity to flourish? And so I think that's the key point, is like, that's what we should want as Christians. And so it isn't that folks should just kind of accept these beliefs, whether or not they're, personally pious or religious in some way, but that these values are key. But I think the more that Christians can understand, like, there are many other people that have similar values of, equality. And so we don't have to say everybody needs to believe that God created everybody in the image of God, although that is what Christians believe. But there are secular folks that say, every person has worth and value. Okay, those are similar values. So how can we partner with them? How can we work alongside them?
Yes.
We don't need to shut them out of the civil sphere. We can actually work together. So a good friend of mine, Andrew Seidel, he's a constitutional lawyer. You've probably had him. Yeah. And so he's written 2 great books on this. And so on Christian nationalism, people should check out.
Definitely.
But, he and I always talk about how, and I think I had him on my podcast too, but we always talk about how we hold different beliefs, right? Really deep kind of personal beliefs, right? So he's an atheist, I'm a Christian. That is very different.
Very different.
But we hold similar values of this pluralistic democratic society. And so he and I, when we allow each other to be a part of the public sphere and to be a seat at the table, but no one has to be at the head of the table, right? Christians don't have to be running the show, but we're both at the table. Then we can talk about, well, we value these things similarly. We have different beliefs, but we have the right to exist and the right to participate. And so then, he and I can sit down and talk about these very deep differences we have in our beliefs, but know that we don't have to dehumanize each other, right? So just like what you said at the top, right? And with your shirt that I love, we can honor the humanity. Yeah, merch store. Let's go. Yeah. So sorry, I feel like I'm tailing off here, but
no, you're good.
That desire, the desire for it that we hear as folks that embrace Christian nationalism talk, I think, in there's that kernel, but it's just pushed in the wrong direction, where then it starts to exclude people, where it starts to put up walls.
Yes. I mean, maybe that's one of the biggest differences here, is that this version of Christianity is advocating for exclusionary everything in every way possible. It wants pretty strict ethnic boundaries. It wants pretty strict immigration boundaries. It wants strict boundaries between men and women and what they can and can't do. And it really wants strict boundaries between the true Christians and everyone else, and who's in power, right? And so it's funny, because me and William probably have more alignment on our Christian beliefs than me and Andrew Seidel, obviously, but me and Andrew's values are infinitely more aligned than the values of me and William, right? So it puts people like us in like an interesting spot, where it's like, well, yeah, but if we share the same beliefs, how are our values so different? I want to play this clip because I want to demonstrate to you folks how this idea of biblical, I just find more as code for justification for us to actually be not that faithful to the Bible. Here's what I mean. Listen to this. Just listen to this real quick. This one here.
But it's also appropriate to love those who are nearest to us more than we love others, right? Like, if you don't, if you lock your doors at night, you're sort of a family nationalist.
How does
so listen, I mean, I don't know how you read the story of the Good Samaritan. I don't know how you read love your neighbor as yourself, not slightly less than yourself or those nearest to you. I don't know how you read even the stories in the Hebrew Bible of God punishing the Israelites for not welcoming the foreigner, and oppressing the poor. I don't know how you actually read the Bible and don't see these themes kind of through and through. Now, that being said, the Bible has a lot of problematic parts in it, no doubt. The slavery, I get all that, folks. I'm not trying to say that the Bible is clear on everything. That isn't my point. And if you listen to the show, you know that we have people who would tell you why it's not clear. But again, like, people like William do not own the corner on the term biblical, even though they pretend that they do. They really actually have no serious authority, which is why I think they're so hell-bent on getting political authority to actually force us into seeing them as authority figures, because William really has no control over someone's salvation or over their view of the Bible. He just likes to pretend that he does. And so this is a great example of like, oh, okay, so Jesus says love your enemy as yourself. Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself. There's all these themes in the Bible that would seem to me that we're supposed to be more inclusive of how we love other people. And William goes, well, those nearest to you, which could mean family, could mean other people. I'm not sure. I don't want to assume. It's okay to have a hierarchy there, And it's like, really? Like, is that really how that works? I'm struggling with how you read that from Jesus. Anyway, what are your thoughts, Andrew? Now I'm ranting.
No. It's good. No, I think that's the key point, is when the idea that the appeals to the Bible and saying, well, it's biblical, so here we go. Like we're telling you where to go. The Bible doesn't bring with it, and here I'm riffing off of the Data Over Dogma guys, right?
Yes,
and,
Dan McClellan. Good.
Dan McClellan, where he's like, the Bible doesn't inherently have authority. Like the groups that interpret it, right, we're going to draw on certain parts and say this has authority. And so here's where, for me, like in American idolatry, I build it off a foundation of the research, but then I move beyond that and make normative claims saying that there isn't empirical support for me to be able to say this is a better interpretation of the gospel. But we need to be clear on that, right? We need to show our hand when I'm saying,
yes,
hey, I'm reading the Bible this way, and this is what I'm getting out of it, and making a claim, a normative claim. We need to realize that we're making that normative claim based on kind of how we've read it, the voices that have interpreted it for us, where that authority comes from is part of the group doing that work. And so when folks are just like, well, the Bible said it and that's it, right, usually, right, that is just turning on this idea of, well, Scripture is clear. And if you just come to it, you could clearly see it. And if you can't clearly see it, then you must be interpreting it wrong. But that's just a fallacy in and of itself. It's the snake eating its tail. Well, if it was clear, then we should all see it the same way, but it's not. Right? There are very different expressions. And so I think just owning that and coming to the discussion with that would be key. But whenever anybody is just saying, well, the Bible is clear and here's exactly how it should be taken, like I would trust more folks that say, hey, there's a lot of ways and different ways people interpret this, but this is the one that I think is supported by the whole of Scripture and moving us towards what those ultimate values are of people's humanity. And so I think that's a really key part.
And this is why I say that from my perspective, fundamentalists don't actually take the Bible seriously enough. They actually take the Bible and they compress it to fit a very specific worldview for it to say certain things to justify whatever it is that they're trying to justify, right? I don't think that fundamentalists take the Bible on its own terms nearly enough. And I think this is why we get in so much trouble with it. I know you got to leave in a few minutes. I know we're running out of time here. I have one more clip. Let's just go through this one, then we'll get ready to wrap up. And I think we have to do a part 2 at some point because there's so much more.
Let's go. I'll come back.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And they're going looking for a fight. Mm-hmm. What warning or encouragement would you give to some of these cage stage Christian nationalists?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that Christians in America weren't the ones that were looking for a fight.
Yeah. Sorry, this is just straight up bullshit. Like, I'm just gonna call it what it is. This is all you gotta do is read anything about Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, Bob Jones, how they sued the government because the government tried to integrate society, and they're like, you're infringing on my religious beliefs. We have to sue you up to the Supreme Court. To make it seem like Christians like William or people in the tradition that he's operating in were just going about their business, trying to be team players, and all of a sudden this liberal monster came and was like, no, we're going to force you into submission and we're going to attack you, is ridiculous. Because the reality is that you can actually see the history of how evangelicals went from being not that politicized to kind of just vote your conscience, do your thing, to this one of the most powerful voting blocks in America based on culture war issues. And again, not culture war issues over even them losing freedom. No one's forcing William to marry a guy. No one's forcing anyone to have an abortion or to insert culture war issue here, okay? But for William, just the fact that other people could live that way, or other people could have the same civil rights as him that he deems immoral, that is automatically an attack. Or if queer people are represented in media somewhere, if they're on a TV show, that's now indoctrination, right? So this is a very, in my opinion, a very like inverted way of trying to make it seem like they're the victims, when in reality, I can tell you right now that we've had a record amount of anti-trans legislation. We have had no trans people putting in legislation to minimize Williams' rights. It's just that simple. All right. So let's just get that very clear. All right. Let's finish it up, and then we'll give you your final thoughts.
Fundamentally, the fight's been brought to us by the deconstructing secularists that want to unravel, biology itself. And so I think that many people. So I'm a millennial, and in Gen Z and beyond, I think you're going to see a sharp departure and adverse reaction to just the radical Marxist woke liberalism that's been foisted down their throats and through their schools. And so they're coming out of this saying that this is insane, and I do want to fight back. And so I'm glad for their
Yeah, okay. So you take the wheel here, but my understanding is that the data tells the opposite, that Gen Z is actually more liberalized, quote unquote, than ever. But I don't know if you know that or not. But anyway, the floor is yours.
No, yeah, I think all the data points that way. I mean, honestly, even over the last 10, 15 years, even Americans that strongly embrace Christian nationalism are liberalizing in their views towards same-sex marriage and some of those culture war issues. So that's happening across the board. Now they're doing it more slowly, but younger generations are more politically liberal on a lot of these, progressive on a lot of these culture war issues, whether they're in the church or not. So there's a lot there, empirically that doesn't quite hold out. But I think this helps kind of put into context some of that clip. So I have a political scientist friend, Paul Jupe, and I write about this in the Fear chapter in my book, where he talks about this, the inverted golden rule that some Christians tend to live by. And I think it's indicative of the fear, the idol of fear within Christian nationalism. So the inverted golden rule stipulates, expect from others what you would do unto them. So just let that kind of marinate a little bit, right? So working from this inverted golden rule, this idea of they attacked us first, they're going to take away our rights, they're coming for us. All of that is operating according to this fear and this belief that we need to do to others what we think they're going to do to us. Like the inability to recognize or realize that by sharing access to the civil society, that maybe we all have rights, right? And we all can participate, and that it isn't a zero-sum game, doesn't really resonate, doesn't click, right? It's not a part of that worldview. So we find empirically Christians, especially those that embrace Christian nationalism, are more likely to restrict civil rights. Whereas atheists, when we look among American atheists, they're much less likely to restrict the civil rights of Christians. And so it really is operating, in a one-way street. But there's more to that. But
I think it was Samuel Perry that posted a while ago on Twitter that in the data he found, that the more right-wing you go, the more you think that your political opponent is an enemy that has to be destroyed, and the more left you go on the graph that he presented, the more you think that you can actually work with your political enemy, and that maybe they're not like the end of the world, trying to kill you kind of vibe. And I think that's very telling. And again, listen, there's always examples of things bucking that trend. But I would just say that like the right-wing side of what we're seeing now in America is very much bent on destroying enemies, and everything that's not them is the enemy and needs to be destroyed and eradicated. And that's why I think we're seeing this shift to a more authoritarian type of political style where Trump is popular, because he'll be their retribution, So they're kind of willing to forego the democratic process once it stops working for them.
For sure.
And now here's the theology and the ideology that then undergirds why that's okay, because the secularists and the Marxists, etc.
Yeah, no, I perfectly said. I think that's really the comfort with authoritarian social control aspect of Christian nationalism, legitimating that in the will of the sacred, would we even let democracy stand in our way from living out what we said God has commanded us to do? No. Yeah. Right? We will set that aside. Yeah. So.
Andrew, thank you for being here. I know we're out of time for you. We will get you back on. As you can see, this is a lot of fun. I love going live on YouTube with everyone and responding to things with actual credible scholars. So thanks for being here, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. Friends, there you go. There goes Andrew. He had an appointment to be at, and that's why we're a little bit shorter than usual. But it was so good being with you, friends. I love doing these. This is part of why we're really trying to launch what we're calling Project Amplify, because there are voices out there like Andrew's who you might never have heard before, but they need to be out there more than ever because they have great ways of responding to so much of the distorted and twisted gospel that we're seeing pushed by Christian nationalism. So if you want to support the work that we do, we are a nonprofit organization. You can donate at the link below. Any donation given is tax deductible, and it's the end of the year. So if you want that sweet tax write-off, please feel free to donate. And like I said, Project Amplify is like our next evolution of content, and it's all about doing more stuff like this on a more professional level to get it out there to more people. So if you want to see that happen, please donate. Love being here with all of you guys. It's great seeing you on a Friday. If you're listening to this on the podcast, thanks for listening. We love your feedback. I'll talk to you all later on. Have a great day, friends.